I welcome John Willis for this podcast. This is a kind of a podcast where I was always waiting to do. Trust me, he's one of the heroes where every DevOps aspirant thinks about. It's not about the book which he has been part of, the handbook of DevOps or anything. Leave that. He's an amazing personality in terms of the DevOps culture. And he has been preaching about the right way in which DevOps is. And he himself preaches that probably there are more technical people than me, but I'm here to teach you the culture of DevOps. And the fact that the founder of Chef gave him a credit card and told him not to evangelize Chef, but go and evangelize the DevOps. And that really shook me away. And it was like, man, I need to listen to some of these insights from John Willis for sure at any cost. And thanks to John Willis for giving me this podcast, means a lot to me, sir.
Yeah, no, great. Just one sort of correction. I was one of the principals at Chef. I was early in, like I was the 8th person there. Not a founder of Chef, but
yeah,
definitely early.
But the founder of the Chef gave you the credit card and he told you,
yeah,
no, evangelize the DevOps.
Got that. I always said that they let me. It was Adam Jacob, who hired me. He was the founder and creator of Chef, and it was the earliest days of DevOps. And I always joked that he must have caught one of those sessions. I said, they just gave me a credit card and said, go out and do this DevOps thing. And it was just great because they were willing to invest in DevOps. And then I had a lot of time to help sort of really build the movement.
Sure. I think let's just start with the questions. Like, I'm pretty amazed that every developer has their own insight about this culture, but I want to know why there's nobody coming up with one common solution, or why there's no architecture which says, hey, just follow this, you are going to get the work done. What is it all about when everybody is coming up with their own techniques and own architecture and own approaches in the DevOps culture?
Yeah, I would say that there's sort of a curse and a blessing of DevOps, right? And the curse is that there isn't one way. And in fact, a lot of people get very frustrated with DevOps because they come in, they want the prescriptive set of things that you need to do this first, this second, this third, right? And I would say that has been by design. Patrick Dubois, who we consider the sort of godfather, the person who coined this, created the first DevOps days. There's a great presentation of him in a DevOps Day, Austin. I think it was like 2018 or 2017. I'd have to double check. But he talked about how he sort of curated the movement along the way, and he never really wanted to be, this kind of, even not even a benevolent dictator. Like he literally just sort of, I would say, sort of kept it in line. And so the curse is people get frustrated that DevOps doesn't sort of, you don't get into it and it's not like a playbook. I mean, again, DevOps handbook is sort of a good, but the blessing is that it's just enough, and it's a great community that can continually contribute their own examples. And so the thing is, you'll find, you get into DevOps and you're like, okay, what is this thing? I don't know what it is. Nobody will give me a canonical answer to what it is. Nobody will give me the prescriptive steps I need to take. But I start seeing, I'm a bank, and I start seeing, how Capital One in the US starts doing things, and their blogs and their contributions to open source. Or I'm in healthcare and I see Cigna, and I see these companies, and I get to sort of follow there. But in the end, I think the thing that makes DevOps so great is it's a set of practices and patterns, right? That's really clear. It's patterns and practice and patterns that enable your organization to do the things that fit for that organization. So DevOps, in a sense, is a melding of the things that are unique about your people, the culture in your company, and these patterns and practices, and you put those together, and you get this thing called DevOps.
Yeah, in one of your talks, I think 7 diseases of DevOps that you have been talking about for a very long time. You said that DevOps is a set of practice and pattern that turns a human capital into a high performance organization capital. That is the definition that you gave for a person who was working in a bank when you just told him what's the definition of DevOps. But I wanted to know, there's DevOps which is lean, but Deming and DevOps is something which you have also been working over a course of time. Like you have also been saying, hey, there's Deming and there's DevOps here. So what is it all about in building an immutable deliverable or an immutable architecture for the DevOps culture?
Yeah. For people, and that I've been obsessed with Dr. Deming for many years now. And there was some early DevOps days discussions where, if you take, for those of you familiar, Gene Kim's The Phoenix Project, right? That was a novel. I met Gene about halfway. It took him 10 years to write that book. It was Kevin Bear and George Stafford. And I met him about 5 years in. And we started talking about, he told me about the book. I got an early copy of it. And we immediately had a discussion about, if you read that book, you were going to want a prescriptive version of it, right? Which became the DevOps Handbook. And one of the things Gene did is he gave me this gift, which was, before he gave me even the earliest copy of the Phoenix Project, he said, you really should read this book first, which was a book by Elliot Goldratt called The Goal. And so for you people who know, the Goal was written in the 1980s by basically a supply chain, a physics professor who became a management consultant. Elliot Goldratt wrote many books. Goal, probably the most famous. Well, Gene's Phoenix Project was a purposeful rewrite of that book, right? Architected and designed to be, Gene even talks about, like in the first, I forget what he goes, the core chronic conflict in The Goal was like the first 170 pages. And I don't remember what the exact number is. They tried to do that same thing in the Phoenix Project. So anyway, I started reading everything by like Goldratt, and it all made sense to me. And then I ran into a guy named Ben Rockwood, who wasn't at Chef when I was there, but just a brilliant guy. He was a voracious reader. And he started telling me, John, it all goes back to this guy called Dr. Deming, and Goldratt, all the things. And he did a great presentation in 2011. It's probably one of the two greatest DevOps presentations ever given. He gave a presentation in 2011 called DevOps Transformation. He connected the dots of, sort of Dr. Deming, Toyota owner over at in Toyota, which became Lean. And I became at that point obsessed with Dr. Deming. And so I've been researching it. And one of the things I tell people is, if you want to understand, there's a lot to read. In fact, I'm writing a book. It'll be out next year. It's about Deming. It's a complete modern version of Dr. Deming and how he impacts autonomous vehicles, how he affects even Amazon. So walk you through all the sort of things. So that'll be a book that'll be out next year. But the thing that I always tell people, if you're not convinced, if you go to a DevOps conference and you look at a couple of DevOps presentations, then go ahead and do a Google on Deming's 14 points. And you'll find it very quickly and read through those points. So I became just obsessed with Deming. And one of the things, and in fact, within the last year, I've decided to really get serious, and I'm pretty much on course now to be able to. I'm going to have a full-blown Deming book early next year, and it's not your classic Deming book. It's going to basically walk you through not only his history, but it'll take you through how Deming works and ideas have impacted things, even like Amazon, autonomous vehicles, even cyber. So, but the thing is, what I tell people, if you want to understand why I think Deming, and the point is, anything we look at in the DevOps, what we've accomplished, we can trace that back to Deming. I'm not saying Deming created DevOps, but I can tell you that the principles, that the cultural, the sort of socio-technical principles and practices and patterns that we want, they're all rooted in a large body of work that Deming created, over 75 years of his life, 80 years of his life. I guess you go back probably 60 or 70 years of work. And the one, if anybody needs a proof, just go ahead and Google Deming's 14 points and read through those, and they just bleed, or just sort of, you see all the DevOps ideas in those 14 points. And that's a 50 or 60-year-old piece of work, so.
Yeah, most of the time you even have said that it's very easy to fall in love with tech and the jargons, because you even told that my son is just 14 years old. He can still run a Lambda instance, and he can, I think he's above that, I think probably. But people are loving tech because of the complexity which is beyond it. Like something like, hey, if I learn AWS, there's going to be a DevOps culture that is going to be so true. But DevOps has been a culture which has been evangelized. But I didn't understand, why do we like tech for its complexity?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting, right, when you think about the kind of people who really like, if I look at my relatives, right, I have a lot of relatives who be like, oh, that computer stuff, right? I think, I don't want to be general. I mean, there are a lot of people in tech that I think they were wired to just love this sort of complex, right? Which is, like probably you or most of the people listen who have written code and love to write code. You probably had that, the first time you wrote your first program and you saw it, and it was so tactile too, right? Because the other thing about programming is I've always loved is that, you have this concept. Imagine before sort of computers having a concept, creating something and getting to see the output of it, right? Like that was hard. Like you had to build a cabinet, or you had to, or manufacture something. We've had this luxury of, I've got this idea that I'd like to do these sort of green dots on the internet that show up when you do, you say a certain word, right? And you get to sort of sit down, even your 14-year-old son, right? You sit down and do it, and like you see it right in front of your face, and then you realize, and then, I mean, I can go on about this. So I don't program as much as I used to, but that idea that you've got all these things in your head and you're sort of connecting the dots, and all of a sudden it's like a Tetris game, right? Where like you move one thing and then all your thoughts align and I got it. This will work. And for me, I'm almost like, where did I get that from? Like you feel like there's sort of magic in there. Like you question, like, how did I even make that leap? So yeah, I think the people who are do sort of tech for a living, not just programming, but solving incidents. And, these are very complex constructs. And I think, I think most people probably listening right now, like it's sort of in your DNA to sort of attack the complex constructs of what all this body of IT gives us, so.
Yeah, because most of the time you also talk about immutable delivery, which is literally somewhat dynamic when you think of a bigger organization where there is a lot of commits which is happening on the production system. Probably there is a backlog of this many amount of tasks and things like that. But what is it all about when you are building such kind of an immutable delivery as a system?
Yeah, no. So I coined that phrase, and so I'm glad you picked up on a lot of cool things that I've thought about over the years. But originally you had Netflix, and I think it was Martin Fowler who had the Phoenix from the Ashes. But certainly there was a great blog article by Netflix where they talked about building systems in Legos. And both of those were starting to introduce the idea of immutable infrastructure, right? And that coincided with things like Chef, right? Or the idea that you're sort of at a certain point in the delivery of your infrastructure, it's an immutable artifact. Your whole operating system, particularly Netflix was doing it primarily on Amazon, right? So that they would actually have an immutable artifact that was the AMI, that was already baked, everything it had. I mean, there was some toppings like that they would fill in the blanks once it got instantiated, things like sort of a zookeeper or metadata that, but in general, the at the point of like you would, I don't know if they used Nexus or something like that, but literally they would have in a repository, an artifact store, an AMI. And so at the time that you were going to start, it would literally pull this immutable artifact. There was no sort of changing or and that really accelerated the industry a lot, because people thought about, okay, well, that's a great way to create clean, the idea that you should never you shouldn't SSH into a server, right? All these things started of cleaner patterns to run infrastructure. And then Docker comes out. And I realized, like, it's almost a shift left, right? Like not just immutable infrastructure, we can actually deliver the actual service or applications we want in immutable format, right? And so it was that it was codifying what Docker brought to the table, or you really sort of just containerization, but Docker was probably, the largest megaphone for that movement. And, I worked at Docker too. I sold a company to Docker. And I just started realizing that it really was a more shift left action of immutability, which is, could I build my application on my desktop in a container image format, test it with the other container image formats in a cluster running in even at a desktop level. And then at that point, hit the cut. So just like what the AMI was the cut at the artifact level, which would be immutable infrastructure, I can move all the way back to the minute I cut my sort of image code, Docker file, all that in one spot, no human touched it. So instead of no human touching it from the time you start the instance and the infrastructure, yes, still do that. But let's go all the way back so that when the developer hits the button of a sort of push, all of the application, the code, the container image, all that stuff is immutable. And I can go on, but there was a Steve Trugat wrote a paper back in 2001, and it was about the difference between congruency and convergence. He talked about sort of convergence, as a convergence was like your chef puppet, and he was working on his own tools at that time, where like you're always converging back to a state, right? But then that's how those things work, right? You say, this is what the state I want to look like, and something like a chef or a puppet engine, it wakes up every 30 minutes, 15 minutes, and it says, looks the state of everything. It says, oh, that's not the way it's supposed to be. Let me put it back to that state. That's a convergence model. That works, and it had worked, but it has the problems. The problems are that complexity sneaks in to systems. So even in a convergent model, you're never at a real consistent state. What he talked about is a congruent model, which really didn't exist when he was talking about it, which was the state is just congruent. It just doesn't change. There is no sort of convergence activity. To a certain extent, there's always going to be congruence, and there's never 100% congruency, convergence, and not 100%. There's always going to be convergence. But the point was, if we create a model state as a congruent model, and again, that, to me, I combine that with Docker, the paper that he wrote, and said, I think this could be well described as immutable delivery.
Yeah, that's true. Because most of the time, even when you give a simple example of Toyota, it's just an organization which brought in the organization structure, and it really changed the way in which they were architecting something which is very meager, like just have a fault tolerance, just have some sort of a definition for what can go wrong and things like that. And you even gave an example of needles over the course of time, and even that book also says that, and how they always used to break, and how they used to just break in the production and things like that. But I wanted to know, why are we learning DevOps in the wrong way? Because a lot of time it's an art of DevOps that we are supposed to be demystified, but it's still a critical component that we think about today. So what is it all about when you are
Yeah.
learning DevOps all about? Because there are core conflicts, there are chronic diseases, as you say. It's like the
Yeah.
7 diseases that pop up, and also there are some roadblocks that also pop up when you are building something using DevOps. So
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bunch of patterns. So my 7 deadly, I just changed it from seven diseases to 7 deadly sins, just given the impact, the world impact of what we went through. I felt it was sort of better to call it sins than diseases. But anyway, but it's the same idea that there are these patterns. And what happened was, after I left Docker, I sold the company Docker and I went independent for a while. And I started getting invited in to do these consulting jobs for CIOs. And part of that was, John, can you help us understand our organization? I need large banks, large insurance companies. And I would go ahead and I was just go and say, you know what, I know a lot of things that are wrong in companies, these patterns, I knew them in my head. I said, why don't I go in with a clean slate? And ultimately what I was building is what I call a qualitative data analysis approach. And I wanted to go in with John, don't walk in there thinking like they're probably doing this, they're probably doing this, they're probably doing this. And then I would interview hundreds of people, and not the leadership, the people who do the work. And I was able to codify. So I had like many ideas of things that go wrong, right? Like if you do this long enough, you're like, there's usually this. But what I started seeing is almost a pyramid of problems. Sort of a reverse pyramid of problems that that I started seeing. And I picked 7. It could have been 9. It could have been 4, right? But 7's a cool number, right? So, but like I could walk in now to any site and say you don't have like sort of a culture of learning. You don't you don't embrace failure. You sort of all those sort of patterns of sort of handy patterns of DevOps. And one of the things that really got me into security, which was almost by accident, the 7th deadly sin, if you will, is something I called security and compliance theater, which meant that you were doing all these things, but at the end of the day, your audits, your representation of your governance, risk, and compliance was theater. And but yeah, they were just the repeatable patterns that you find that sort of usually just even that sort of idea of the Brent character in the Phoenix Project, right? You would as I would go and interview hundreds and hundreds of people, you start to identify 3 or 4 people who were Brents. Every company's got them. They're the kind of people that great-hearted. They want to solve all the problems. So they never say no. And the way you can identify them is usually you'll be in a room of a bunch of people and some junior person will say, you know what, I have no idea how we do X, X, Y, Z. And some senior person will, well, that's easy. You go to Brent, and they're like, yeah, I go to Brent, but like he has no time to explain anything to me. And Brent's too busy. Like he'll like, yeah, give it to me, I'll do it. Yeah, but can you show me how to do it so I can do it myself next time? I'm like, I really can't. I'm just too busy. I'll just do it. And it just creates this sort of vortex of non-learning. And so, one of the prescriptions of that is, horizontalize the Brents. I mean, the Phoenix Brents had a great story because they used like theory of constraints as an example. I mean, I think it's much simpler. It's like wherever you have these bottlenecks of learning, attack those to create them as they're horizontal. Just go after, because the real bottlenecks are not the work, no disrespect to the Phoenix Project, the bottlenecks are learning. Because there's a side effect when the young person gets hired. Banks struggle to hire talent, or anybody, because what the top talent coming to university, where are they going these days? They're going to Google, they go to Amazon, they're picking up the cream of the crop, right? So every once in a while, a large bank will get one of those cream of the crop candidates because maybe they have a minor in finance and they like they could have gone to Google, but they go to a large bank. But then they spend a year in a large bank where they don't learn anything. Because they're constantly trying, every time they want to, do something, like just give it to, the mythical Brent and they go, hey, Brent, I really want to learn this, because they're brilliant young people, right? They want to look, and all they get back is like, just give it to me. I really don't have time. And after a year, what do they do? They're like, you know what? I tried. I'm going to Google. Right. So like, there's so many negative side effects. And to which the biggest is, one of the things my coworker, my boss, my good dear friend, Andrew Clay Schaefer, in fact, the second greatest DevOps presentation, the first or second, I think they're tied for first. Second greatest presentation is Andrew Clay Schaefer's There Is No Talent Shortage. And he has this great saying. He says, you're either a learning organization or you're losing to one who is. Right. And that's the question you have to ask yourself. We want to, like, the tech is great. Like, we can do all the great things of tech. The question that when I go back to the CIO and I walk through the 7 patterns and we go through some examples of all these things, misalignments of work and, the sort of the Brents, the bottlenecks, the question that lays on the table, have you created an environment? Have you given the bandwidth? Have you given the freedom? Have you given the trust? Do you accept the trust to create a learning organization? And I'll give one example. Like, I hear a lot of people say, yeah, I went to this job, I got a senior position, they paid me a lot of money. And then anytime I ask to go to a conference or a training, they say, why do you need it? You're a senior person. There's these sort of mindset is that at a certain level, you're so smart that there's no budget for, extra company activities. Like, what? Are you out of your mind? Like, the people that you probably, where do you get the most value? You take the people who is the leadership, the people who are, sort of thinking, and they want to feed themselves with more learning opportunity. And you're sort of saying, well, you know what? I don't think, why would you have to get trained? We hired you as an industry expert. The archaic way to think. So the question, again, go back to, if you think through all the things you do as an organization, if you're asking yourself, are we a learning organization? Do we create the bandwidth? Do we allow the people the freedom? Do we give them some percentage time to figure out things? Do we give them the trust? Like, if I'm a senior leadership and I say I need to go to this conference to learn some stuff, you're like, okay, here's the credit card. It's not like, well, really, do you need to learn that at your level? Oh, man, like, you paid me all this money. Trust me that I'm not going to waste your money. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm too busy. If I need to go to the conference, just say yes, So, yeah.
That's true. That's true. Because a lot of times that trust is going to just going to give an amplified effect on somebody's life. Like, it can really change the mindset of any culture that we have been part of, and probably there might be some new things. So you, Jeff Barr, Jim Collins have been the early adopters of evangelism and advocacies in the world of development that we are talking today. But I wanted to know, how was that process all about, shifting more towards educating developers over the course of time and telling them this is what your right approach is? So how are those days when you three rock the world of evangelizing and educating developers?
Yeah, I think, again, if we look at some of the, we talked about Deming, right? One of the things that was really interesting about Deming, which was, and I've been doing an incredible amount of research on this, which is like, I find all these like really interesting stories for the book I'm writing. But during World War II, there the Japanese scientists and engineers and all that, they were bearing the brunt of the war. And this is just a general air war. They said that every time they captured an Allied plane, particularly a US plane, the engineers would basically sort of dissect the plane and try to figure out the quality. And there was a quote in a book called The Reckoning by David Hattleston, where he says that those engineers were sickened by the gap in quality, right? Like, they would literally were sickened by when they see these things, they were like, oh my God, we are so far behind the quality. and what people don't know is Deming was involved in a lot of that sort of during war quality initiative, right? And so then the war's over, and General MacArthur is sort of the governor in chief of Japan during the sort of Allied occupation, and he volunteers Dr. Deming to come over there to fix things. And so you got all these Japanese, engineers that knew the quality was amazing and that they didn't know this stuff. And then they're given this gift of like the country just beat us partially because the quality of their military equipment. They're going to give us the person who taught America to build that quality. In fact, there's another quote in a Dr. Duran book where he says, Deming took the same class that he was giving during the war on quality control. And when he went over to Japan, he literally took that same exact class, didn't change it, and started teaching it. And so the Japanese were like, wow, we know what the quality is, and you're going to now teach us. Now, but the focus now was not on military. The Japanese had realized, like, we're done. We're not doing the military thing anymore. But it was all about industrialization. And so all of that just became part of what has been called the sort of miracle in Japan, right? So from where 1950 to almost 1960, they arise to be a world economic power. And out of that, you get Toyota. And with Toyota, you have all this like great quality and initiative that's been bled in throughout all Japan. Like the best TVs are being created by the 1970s, right? There's nobody in the United States that you don't own an American-made TV. Like you just don't, right? Like, so Toyota, but then the thing is Deming doesn't get all the credit because there was that sort of culture, work ethic. It was intrinsic natured people that felt if you asked somebody at Toyota what they did, they wouldn't say, I do the brakes. They wouldn't say, I do the tires or I do the axles. They'd say, I build cars. Right. And so you combine that with the quality control initiatives that Deming brought into there, taught pretty much most of the nation. There was a point at which Deming was giving a seminar where like 80% of the wealth of Japan was in this seminar. And he told them, if you follow my methods in 5 years, you'll be a world economic power, And then you take the Toyota and Toyoichi Ono, who was a brilliant man, and he really understood from what he learned from Ford. I mean, they studied Ford. He took, what the culture of Japan had to offer and how do you create a company where everybody's so intrinsically motivated. And I can go on, unions in Japan were basically by company. So in America, like if you had a strike, the auto workers would strike or whatever, like it would be all auto workers across all companies. The gamification, if you will, in Japan was if Toyota struck, then Nissan would benefit, right? Because it was unions were by company. So there's just a lot of things, but ultimately the long-winded answer is in America, mostly in America, I mean, around the world, but certainly academia in the 80s started picking up on what Japan was doing. I think it was John Krackaft who coined lean. He said what they're doing there is what America would call lean. And because they were literally looking at like the principles. Some of those principles came from Deming, some of them came from the culture, the sort of tsunami culture of Japan, this island culture that never had a lot of resources. So they were really big on waste, right? All that becomes lean manufacturing. And then, I always think a person who doesn't get near as much credit in the influence of what we have today is Mary Poppendieck. So Mary Poppendieck is the first one to do sort of a translation of lean manufacturing to lean software development. That's brilliant. Like that leap. I mean, it probably would have happened without her, but she writes the canonical book called Lean Software Development. At that point, nobody's really put anything canonical on paper. about, how these principles of manufacturing that came from Toyota, ultimately parts of them came from Deming, could be applied to software development. And that, and at the same time, you have got Agile going on and all this stuff, the Agile Manifesto. But the point being, that groundwork she laid by saying, that we can use this body of work. And just to go back to Deming, one of the things that Deming was, Deming took, in his early days, he learned something from a guy named Dr. Schuett, which is the core of quality control. And people say, was he just an imitation of Schuett or not? The difference was Schuett, almost throughout his life, basically created a model for manufacturing. What Deming did is he saw that where he would apply that to, agriculture. He would apply it to geometrics, the jury selection. He would apply it to literally anything. And so, like that opens up, you start seeing all these sort of cross paths happening, lean software development, Agile being sort of pulled from a lot of things that sort of come from lean, but then from other ideas of how to develop software. Then we've got DevOps, right? Sort of umbrelling all that. And again, at the end of the day, there are these social technical constructs, right? Part of them are pure technical. I mean, we could start a DevOps conversation and go on for hours where we're just talking about, pipelines and GitOps and, very technical stuff. And nobody would accuse us of having a non-DevOps conversation. I could turn around and have a conversation where I talk about, how do we smooth out bottlenecks? How do we how do we create systems approach to the way people collaborate and think? How do we embrace complexity in a social sort of way, and address all the complexity science that we know, including learning organizations, Peter Senge, Daniel Kahanahan, all that stuff. And again, that would be a legitimate DevOps conversation as well, with nothing, where we didn't even talk about any code, any configuration. We just talked about, complex systems thinking, and how we how the human element, one of the greatest things about Deming, one of my what I'm calling a meta metaphor in the book is he was a humanist. There was something in his life that he early on, his childhood or whatever, he just not that he fought for the little man, he just believed systems couldn't work if you didn't treat the I'm belittling the worker, like if you, it wasn't that like he wasn't like a crusader for the worker. He just believed that systems could not work effectively if you didn't treat the worker like a human. So.
Yeah, that's true, sir. That's true. Because a lot of times when we think of this ninja security guys, which they say, hey, we are here to keep your secure systems more secure over a course of time. But now it's not like DevOps people didn't do security. There was security over a course of time, but now it's more of an emphasis today, like DevSecOps is coming up. And there are early days of computing, which used to be so slow that everybody used to just wait 6 months to just get the clock up and running. Like it used to be an amplified version of the same clock which we used to have. But I wanted to know, what is this fundamental theory of everything in DevOps? Because we always have a plan B when there's a chaos. There is a test for chaos engineering. There is a lot of chaos engineers who are architecting the solution. So I wanted to know, what is the fundamental theory of everything in DevOps? And is it still a retrospective flow that we are just gathering some information and just implementing in the organization? What is it all about?
Yeah, no, it's sort of interesting. One of the things that I've always loved about the DevOps movement is there was sort of an unwritten law of check your ego at the door. And I like even all in the DevOps days, I think at some point, probably still true today, that I've been sort of noted as the person who's been to more DevOps days than sort of anybody else in the world, right? And I was as we were going through year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, I'd say that, like, hey, one thing that I love about this, a lot of times I'd do a keynote or an introduction, and I'd say one of the things I love about this movement, it just, we've been like so blessed to be egoless. And I'm like, maybe next year it's gonna stop, but and I don't think it has, right? And that's what creates great collaboration, right? And because when people are willing to walk into sort of open space and have a discussion, and we all have egos, like, let's not kid ourselves. I have an ego, we all, but for the most part, the goal of most of the DevOps movement around DevOps days, particularly, was a very kind of come in with everything listen to what everybody else knows, and then let's basically sort of move the sort of ball forward down the field, if you will. And what that, like, so the thing that happened then is, and you've seen this, you go to a DevOps conference and, like, you might go to one session where somebody's talking about leadership and system thinking and or cultural aspects. And you go to the next session and somebody's giving this amazing presentation of how they use GitOps, and they've been able to use this, and then even if you think about like chaos engineering, right? That's something that was particularly defined at Netflix. But then it gets presented at DevOps days and people are like, wow, that's a great idea. Right. And they open source it. So people look the open source, then you have people creating all these sort of variants of the chaos engineering. And in fact, there's some great stuff going on now. I'm an advisor for a company called Verica, where they call it continuous verification. Which is, if we go back to the earlier discussion about convergence and congruency, like, in a sense, almost everything is going to have to be converged. So one of the things that they focus on is sort of security chaos engineering. So even though if in your pipelines, you've bolted everything down so that you should never have this library running in production, or this port should never be opened. Well, there's complexity, adds drift, like, just things happen. So why not just open that port in production, see what happens? Why, use chaos engineering to fire up a container that has a vulnerable image, right? So sort of inject the things that should never happen and see how systems react. But yeah, chaos engineering is a good example. SRE is a great example of people or organizations finding their own patterns, collaborating them, not saying, oh, we've got some secret source, let's not tell anybody about it, exposing, and in some cases writing books about it. In fact, a lot of books these days on the technical, and all that just getting thrown into what I would call a primordial soup of DevOps. And it happens because the nature of the conversation in DevOps is, to me, always been check your ego at the door, come in with the expectation that you're going to have high effective learning with the people you're going to interact with, and then be open to contribute what you've learned. And it just creates this acceleration. And if we look at the last 10, 15 years of everything, does Uber exist in its format without DevOps? I don't think so. Right. And that's DevOps in the broadest sense. It's not just all the cultural stuff. It's the being able to run, sort of infrastructure where you can deliver software couple hundred times a day. Right. And so a lot of that is about the DevOps conversation, about the technical, the pipelines and how you develop pipelines, how you do CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, Jez Humble's, sort of canonical book on continuous delivery. Right. Like, I don't think you have Airbnb and Uber in the format. And again, there's a lot of contributing factors. Open source is clearly one. I think all the principles of DevOps, technical and social, because you can do the technical stuff and scale to a certain point, but we all know if you don't have the cultural aspects, that hits a brick wall.
Yeah.
So again, I think this last 10 years, in fact, the original byline of the IT revolution, sort of the whole body of work that comes out of Gene's organization, we originally tagged it as the Cambrian explosion. that like that it's like what happened a billion years ago, whatever, that sort of created this life form was a Cambrian explosion. Like we believe, I believe that in 30, 40, 50 years from now, people are going to look back at this sort of period from somewhere like 2000 and early 2000s to 2020-ish or something like that, and say there was this incredible acceleration of technology and all these things that you sort of look back, I think in 30, 40 years ago, they'll say that seemed to be a pocket that accelerated so many things. Like Amazon's going to be a great case, just like Toyota sort of number one case study for most things today. I think people will look at Amazon, I mean, they already are, and say, like to say, how did they sort of decimate everybody else in everything? Grocery stores, IT infrastructure, like whatever, clothing, prescription medicine. Like they've become this, the Toyota of the 21st century, basically.
Yeah, because a lot of times when we think of self-driving cars, because that's where my research is more inclined towards, and DevOps, that is a kind of a chaos environment when we think of what if I break a point and everything starts smashing up and there's no prediction which comes and says that, hey, even though your car crashed, there is no crash happened or things like that. But I wanted to know, because there is always a plan B for all the fault tolerance, but I wanted to know what's the ultimate consequence of building a secure and a very sturdy, rigid DevOps culture inside any organization. What is it all about when we think of the consequence of building the best practices in the DevOps in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, it would sound like a cliched answer, but I guess it's not really, right? What do you want? You want the ability to have the speed to be able to sort of deal with changes, add features or functions or services or ideas faster than your competitors. You want to be able to entertain your customers in such a way that you're getting constant feedback, so you're not just sitting back, and sort of being sort of arrogant, or oh no, we've got the best software, don't worry, like so you want the speed, but you want to be able to deliver fast, you want to be able to get feedback fast. Like these are just natural, like successful business behaviors, and then you want to do it at a cost that has a reasonable ratio to the output that you get from it. Like, so in other words, in some ways, spending a lot of money, Amazon spends an incredible amount of money on hiring people. So it isn't always about bottom line ROI. So you want speed, you want basically feedback, and you want to do it at a cost that is a positive ratio for what you're getting the value at. And then there's a fourth pillar there, is you always have to protect the brand, right? And that's your governance, risk, and compliance. Because ultimately it is your organization that is at risk. Like if you look at, sort of the breaches, breaches can swallow a company. If you're a bank and all of a sudden 150 million bank records get out, like I'm probably going to switch banks, right? So you need to protect the brand, and the way we think about protecting brands is through governance, risk, and compliance. What do we do with risk? Well, risk is a body of how we make evidence, our audit evidence. So like that starts the conversation of a DevSecOps. Are we just delivering software willy-nilly without checking anything? Or are we being incredibly rigorous about like doing scans at all levels? Do we scan the source code at the IDE level to give you a tip? Hey, you might not want to use this parameter. You might not want to use this library. So there's sort of built-in IDE tools that will scan stuff as you're sort of building your code. And then like we have tools that will just scan your Git repository continually. And then at the build level, we start getting more advanced about like our sort of SAST and DAST, or software composition analysis. And then we start embedding all these things that are showing that we're being, we're still got the model, we're delivering software fast, we're trying to keep the pipeline going so the developers can sort of iterate really quick and not be encumbered. But we're also embedding a lot of things that are basically at the end of the day, creating controls and audit evidence that says we're really doing our best to protect the brand. Right. And so I think it's those four things that like DevOps gives us the ability to explore. And in the end, those, whether we're talking about in 2021 or we're talking about in 1950, if you're building and selling things, you want to be relatively, I mean, if you look at, there's some great presentations by Dr. Spear where he shows like, you go back to 1950, basically it took 4 people at Toyota to build, so I might not get this exactly right, but like it took like 8 or 16 people at Toyota to build what General Motors or Ford could build with 4 people. By the time you get to 1960 or mid to late 60s, they're at parity. It's 4 to 4. By the time you get to the 70s, it's now flipped. It's 4 people in GM or Ford to build a car, and it's 2 people to build the same car at Toyota. And another thing that starts happening is Toyota starts doubling they're shortening by half the amount of time to deliver a new brand. So not only are they now gone from like complete like chaos, 16 to 4 to parity, to in the 70s, it's taking, 2 engineers, 2 delivery engineers to every 4 in the US, and Japan is basically coming out with a new model in half the time that American car makers are doing, right? That's that sort of speed ratio, but you don't get that without the feedback. We learn, another great book, if, it sounds like you've actually a reasonably good student of mine, because you've all these kind of things you brought up was very flattering. But so then, hopefully, and if you haven't, Mike Rother's Toyota Kata, it's just an amazing book where he goes and he talks about what he learned from Toyota, and they nail the feedback. It's in their DNA, they're like scientific method. Rother calls it improvement kata, a kata, for improvement. There's this sort of form that if you do it over and over, like kabuki theater or judo, like if you just do it over and over, you just start improving the form. They had that, so they had that's what enabled them to go from 16 to 4 to 4 to 4, to America 4 and Japan 2, and then doubling the, shortening the time in half of what it takes America. And then the story goes on and on. I mean, there's a good book called Toyota Supply Chain where they compare the Volt, GM Volt, to the Prius, and it's just comical how like the comparison of what it cost in people, time, materials to build the Prius, and then how versus the Vault, and then how successful the Prius was after it was built compared to the Vault. So and again, we don't see as much in the lean conversation of what we sort of try to understand now in DevSecOps, which is sort of what I would call brand protection at the end of the day, right? Which is your GRC. But it was there, right? It was, there was, that whole sort of, sort of respect level, it played into their quality. They didn't want to, like there was sort of this thing that like, even if you swept the floors at Toyota, you felt that you were responsible for the quality of a car that your neighbor, Steve Spear once said that, the real sort of what the pull system really was that the idea that people at Toyota knew that one of their neighbors might, or their mother or their brother or their neighbor might buy a car that they worked on, would actually cost them 70% of their yearly salary to buy that car. And whether you swept the floor, did the brakes, did the axles, whatever, it was your responsibility to make sure that your neighbor, your brother, your uncle, your mother who bought that car had a quality car.
Yeah, when you talked about the judo and the things like that, I remember the talk which you gave on TDD and the BDD. Have we really brought any change over a course of time? And what are the consequences of it? Because a lot of times when we think of the development, you also talk about variability. There has to be something which is variable, and you also need to break things up, just try putting it down. That's what you told about. Let's just look at those ports in the production and let's break it, the chaos engineering part. But I wanted to understand, like, what are the consequences of all these techniques that we are talking today? And right now, what is it all about? Last question.
Yeah, no problem. And I think that's another thing I like about the Toyota supply chain. They talk about the 4 V's of learning. And we don't do enough of this conversation. I try to inject it periodically, but there's some beauty in the 4 V's of learning. It's a velocity, variability. So it's variability, variety, velocity, and visibility. So the 4. The 2 that get really interesting is, not that visibility isn't interesting, but and velocity is sort of like easily understood, right? We've talked a lot about that. But variability, let's start with variability. Variability is sort of more of an economic choice of, sort of balancing the risk versus the things you do, like speed versus sort of risk is one of those variability. It's sort of an economic balance where you get the art of understanding, what creating variability. It should always be sort of bounded by the economic risk, or any sort of, not just any form of risk around that variability, right? And this is a much longer conversation, but it means that it's not just variability, variety. Variety is the sort of construct to balance the economics versus the choices that you make for speed. And then variability, is the pure art of what comes out of Shewhart that Deming was a big proponent of, which is understanding primarily statistical process control, special and common cause variation. Again, there's just so much here that we got like a minute left. To understand Deming's work is all of the sort of quality contracts called analytical statistics around understanding the variation. And then the positive, the negative, the sort of understanding the variant, how variation sort of looks, whether it's anomalous or it's sort of pattern based. So I think that the 4 VLs are very interesting. I've given presentations on sort of trying to understand how those play in the DevOps world, but and a variety is a underutilized and understood way to create economic balance between all the other V's. And then, you can spend a lifetime exploring variation, if you will. And certainly starting with Dr. Shewhart and Deming's sort of lifelong. One last thing I'll say is Deming's, it's most likely, the name of my book is going to be called Profound, because one of Deming's final works was a book called New Economics, where he defined what he called the system of profound knowledge, where he looked at complexity under the lenses of certain things, and one of those certainly was variation. So yeah, that's good. I probably have to jump now, so you might
want to sure, no problem. Thank you so much for this amazing podcast. Means a lot to me, and thank you so much for making my day a happier day today.
Yeah, I know, it's great insight, great questions. Thank you so much too. So, all right.
Welcome, sir.
All right, bye.